The dense forest of Belarus holds its secrets deep within the marshes and birch groves. In the summer of 1943, somewhere in this vast wilderness, a Soviet partisan unit found itself surrounded by overwhelming German forces. What followed was 6 weeks of relentless pursuit, a nightmarish game of cat and mouse through swamps and forests that would claim almost every life in the detachment. When the operation finally concluded, only 3 men emerged from the shadows to recount the horrors they had witnessed. Their testimony would reveal one of the most brutal anti-partisan campaigns of the Eastern Front. If you find yourself gripped by stories of courage against impossible odds, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps uncover more forgotten chapters of history like this one. The year 1943 marked a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. The German Wehrmacht, still reeling from the catastrophe at Stalingrad, faced a growing threat not only from the advancing Red Army, but from within its own occupied territories. In Belarus, the land the Germans called White Ruthenia, a shadow war had been raging since the earliest days of Operation Barbarossa. The forests that covered nearly half the republic had become a haven for escaped Soviet soldiers, downed airmen, Jews fleeing the ghettos, and local peasants who refused to submit to German rule. By the spring of 1943, these disparate groups had coalesced into organized partisan brigades numbering in the tens of thousands. The partisan zones had become a genuine threat to German logistics. Railway lines that carried troops and supplies to the front were being sabotaged with increasing regularity. German garrisons found themselves under constant attack. The occupation authorities controlled the towns, but the forests belonged to the partisans. For the German High Command, this was an intolerable situation. As the preparations for Operation Citadel, the massive summer offensive against the Kursk salient, moved forward, the rear areas had to be secured. The partisan movement had to be crushed. Heinrich Himmler's SS and police forces had been waging anti-partisan warfare since 1941, but the scale of operations in 1943 dwarfed anything that had come before. The doctrine was simple and brutal. The partisans drew their strength from the local population, so the population had to be destroyed, along with the partisans. Villages suspected of providing food or shelter to the resistance were to be burned to the ground. Their inhabitants were to be shot, deported to slave labor in the Reich, or simply left to die in the elements. The Germans called this policy the creation of dead zones, vast swaths of territory where nothing would live to support the resistance. The operation that would seal the fate of our partisan detachment began in late May of 1943. The Germans codenamed it Operation Cottbus, after a city in eastern Germany. The target was the partisan zone in northern Belarus, centered on the areas of Bogomil, Lepel, and Ushachi. This region had become one of the most formidable partisan strongholds in all of occupied Europe. Multiple Soviet partisan brigades operated here, controlling dozens of villages and maintaining regular contact with Moscow via radio and even small aircraft that landed on improvised forest airstrips. The German forces assembled for Operation Cottbus were substantial. Regular Wehrmacht security divisions, SS police battalions, and most notoriously, the SS Special Battalion Durlawanger, all converged on the target area. Alongside them came Latvian, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian collaborationist units, men who knew the local terrain and could identify partisan sympathizers. The total force numbered well over 20,000 men, supported by artillery and aircraft. Against them stood perhaps 10,000 partisans, lightly armed and dependent on the forest and the local population for survival. The Petrov detachment, as we shall call them using the name of their commander, was one of the smaller units operating in the Cottbus target area. Numbering approximately 120 fighters, they had been organized the previous autumn from escaped prisoners of war and local volunteers. Their commander, Captain Mikhail Petrov had been a Red Army officer captured during the disastrous encirclement battles of 1941. He had escaped from a prisoner of war camp where thousands of Soviet soldiers were dying of starvation and typhus, made his way through German lines, and spent the winter of 41 to 42 evading capture before finally linking up with other partisans in the forests of northern Belarus. By the spring of 1943, the Petrov detachment had established itself as an effective fighting force. They had derailed several German supply trains, ambushed convoys on the road between Lapel and Polotsk, and assassinated a German district commissar who had distinguished himself by his brutality toward the local population. The Germans had put a price on Petrov's head, as they had on the heads of most partisan commanders. The detachment operated from a base camp deep in the forest, a collection of earth bunkers hidden beneath the trees and connected by narrow paths known only to the partisans. From here they could strike at German targets and then melt back into the wilderness. The first sign that something unprecedented was coming arrived in mid-May. Partisan scouts reported massive German troop movements on the roads leading into the forest zone. Artillery batteries were being positioned along the forest's edge. Aircraft were conducting systematic reconnaissance flights over the trees, looking for signs of partisan camps. The partisan command structure, coordinated by radio with Moscow, issued warnings to all units in the area. A major anti-partisan operation was imminent. The brigades were to disperse into smaller groups and avoid decisive engagement until the storm passed. Captain Petrov gathered his command group around a map spread out on a rough wooden table in the main bunker. The situation was clear but not hopeless. The detachment would break into 3 groups. Each would move to a pre-designated hiding place deeper in the forest. They would maintain radio silence to avoid German direction-finding equipment. When the operation concluded, they would reassemble at a rallying point near the village of Berezino. On the morning of May 20th, 1943, Operation Cottbus began. The Germans attacked on multiple axes simultaneously, pushing into the forest from the north, south, and east. Their tactic was the classic anti-partisan cordon and search. Lines of troops would advance through the forest, driving anyone they encountered toward blocking positions established in their rear. Artillery would pound suspected partisan locations. Aircraft would spot groups trying to flee and call in ground forces to intercept them. The forest would be combed systematically, sector by sector, until nothing remained. The Petrov detachment's first group, commanded by a young lieutenant named Sergei Volkov, ran into German forces almost immediately. They had been moving toward their designated hiding place when they stumbled into a German patrol. A brief firefight erupted. 3 partisans fell in the first exchange of gunfire. Volkov managed to extricate his men and break contact, but now the Germans knew there were partisans in this sector. The hunt was on. For the next 48 hours, Volkov's group ran. They moved at night, guided by the stars and their knowledge of the terrain. During the day they lay hidden in dense thickets, scarcely daring to breathe, as German patrols passed within meters of their hiding places. They had no food. Their water came from swampy puddles that they strained through cloth. 2 more men died from their wounds, unable to be treated without medical supplies. Their bodies were buried in shallow graves, marked only by a few sticks, so that someday, if anyone survived, the dead could be properly honored. The second group, led by Petrov himself, had better luck initially. They reached their hiding place, a series of natural caves in a rocky outcropping, without encountering German forces. But their relief was short-lived. On the 3rd day of the operation, German aircraft spotted smoke rising from the caves. Whether it was from a carelessly lit fire or simply moisture rising from the damp rocks, no one would ever know. Within hours, German ground forces had surrounded the position. Petrov faced an impossible choice. His group of 40 men was trapped against the rock face. The Germans had brought up machine guns and were calling for artillery support. To stay was to die. The only chance was to break through the encirclement under cover of darkness. That night the partisans attacked. The breakout was a bloodbath. The Germans had anticipated exactly this move and had positioned their forces accordingly. Machine gun fire cut through the charging partisans. Men fell screaming in the darkness. Petrov was hit in the shoulder but kept moving, supported by 2 of his men. Of the 40 who attempted the breakout, perhaps 15 made it through the German lines. The rest lay dead or dying on the forest floor. Now the situation became truly desperate. The survivors were scattered, wounded, and nearly out of ammunition. The forest that had been their sanctuary had become a death trap. Everywhere they turned, there were Germans. The sound of gunfire echoed through the trees as other partisan groups met similar fates. Smoke rose from burning villages as the Germans implemented their dead zone policy with ruthless efficiency. Take a moment to like this video if you appreciate learning about these often overlooked aspects of military history. Your engagement helps bring more stories like this to light. The 3rd group of the Petrov detachment, commanded by a senior sergeant named Ivan Kovalenko, managed to evade the initial German sweep entirely. Kovalenko was a former collective farm worker who had joined the partisans after the Germans murdered his family. He knew the forest like he knew his own hands, every stream and ravine, every path and hiding place. Under his leadership, his group of 35 men moved like ghosts through the German cordon. But even Kovalenko's skill could not protect them forever. On the 8th day of the operation, they were spotted by a German reconnaissance aircraft. Within the hour, ground forces were converging on their position from 3 directions. Kovalenko made a split-second decision. The group would split up, every man for himself. Some might escape where a group could not. The partisans scattered into the undergrowth like startled deer. What followed was a nightmare of pursuit and death that would continue for nearly 6 weeks. The Germans, having broken the organized partisan resistance in the first days of the operation, now turned to hunting down the survivors individually. Small teams of German soldiers, often accompanied by local collaborators who knew the terrain, tracked the scattered partisans through the forest. When they caught up with their quarry, there was rarely any attempt at capture. The partisans were shot on sight. The Derlewanger Battalion distinguished itself in this phase of the operation by its particular brutality. This unit, composed largely of convicted criminals recruited from German prisons, had developed methods of anti-partisan warfare that horrified even other SS officers. When they caught partisans, death was often only the beginning. Bodies were mutilated and left on display as warnings. Villages where fugitives were discovered were burned with their inhabitants still inside. One German report noted that Derlewanger especially has a reputation for destroying many human lives. Lieutenant Volkov's group was among the first to be annihilated completely. Cornered against a river swollen with spring runoff, they fought until their ammunition was exhausted. Volkov was the last to fall, empty pistol in hand. German soldiers found 17 bodies on the riverbank. Not a single man had surrendered. Captain Petrov's luck ran out in early June. His small band of survivors had been on the run for over 2 weeks, subsisting on roots, berries, and the occasional fish, caught with improvised lines. They were skeletal, their uniforms in rags, their weapons nearly useless from lack of maintenance and ammunition. They were hiding in a dense thicket when a German patrol, led by dogs, picked up their scent. The partisans tried to run, but they were too weak, too exhausted. The Germans caught them within a kilometer. Petrov was among those captured alive, a rarity in these operations. The Germans wanted to interrogate him, to extract information about the partisan command structure and the locations of hidden arms caches. For 3 days, Petrov was held at a temporary field headquarters and subjected to brutal questioning. He revealed nothing. On the 4th day, he was taken to a clearing along with 6 other captured partisans. The Germans formed a firing squad. Petrov refused a blindfold. He was reported to have shouted, Za Rodinu for the motherland before the bullets silenced him. By mid-June, the organized phase of Operation Cottbus was winding down. The official German reports claimed approximately 9,800 people eliminated, along with nearly 5,000 captured for forced labor. But these figures, gruesome as they were, almost certainly understated the true death toll. The German radio boasted of 15,000 eliminated, and this figure may have been closer to the truth. Modern historians estimate that at least 20,000 people died during the operation, the vast majority of them unarmed civilians. Of the Petrov detachment's original 120 fighters, the accounting was devastating. Volkov's group of 35 had been wiped out to the last man. Petrov's group of 40 had suffered similar fate, with the commander himself among the confirmed dead. Kovalenko's group, the last to be engaged, had scattered to the winds. Of the 35 who had dispersed on the 8th day of the operation, only scattered reports existed. Most were presumed eliminated, but the forest still held its secrets. Deep in the swamps that even the Germans feared to enter, a handful of survivors clung to life. Among them were 3 men from the Petrov detachment who had managed to evade capture through a combination of skill, luck, and sheer determination. The first survivor was a young Jewish partisan named Yakov Feldman. Before the war, Feldman had been a student at the Medical Institute in Minsk. When the Germans captured the city, he had been forced into the ghetto along with the rest of the Jewish population. He had escaped during a mass shooting in 1942, fleeing into the forest with nothing but the clothes on his back. The Partisans had taken him in, and his medical knowledge, limited as it was, had made him invaluable. When Kovalenko's group scattered, Feldman had run into the deepest part of the swamp. He knew that the Germans would not follow him there. For 3 weeks, he had survived alone, eating whatever he could find, often submerged to his neck in stagnant water to avoid detection. He had contracted malaria, but somehow survived. The second survivor was one of the original members of the detachment, a former Red Army soldier named Alexei Morozov. Morozov had been captured in the Minsk pocket in 1941, spent time in a German prisoner of war camp, escaped, and joined the Partisans in early 1942. He was tough as boiled leather, a man who had already survived conditions that would have ended most others. When the final pursuit began, Morozov had instinctively sought the highest ground he could find, a densely wooded ridge that the Germans passed by without searching thoroughly. He had spent 5 weeks on that ridge, moving only at night, eating bark and insects. The third survivor was the most unlikely of all. His name was Pyotr Volkov, no relation to the lieutenant, a 16-year-old boy who had joined the Partisans after his village was burned by the Germans in a reprisal action. Pyotr had been the youngest member of the detachment, serving mainly as a messenger and scout. When the order came to scatter, Pyotr had done something counterintuitive. Instead of fleeing deeper into the forest, he had moved toward the German lines, reasoning that they would not expect Partisans to approach them. He had hidden in the ruins of a burned village, scavenging food from abandoned gardens and cellars. When the Germans moved on, he was still there, half-starved, but alive. These 3 men found each other in late July, after the Germans had declared Operation Cottbus concluded and withdrawn most of their forces from the area. The forest was eerily quiet. The villages that had once dotted the landscape were gone, burned to ashes. The paths that had connected them were overgrown. The population that had sustained the Partisans had been murdered, deported, or scattered. Feldman, Morozov, and young Pyotr Volkov made their way carefully through the devastated landscape. They encountered other survivors, remnants of other partisan units that had suffered similar fates. Slowly, painfully, the resistance began to reconstitute itself. But the losses were staggering. Some units had been completely wiped out. Others had been reduced to a handful of survivors. The partisan zone that had once challenged German control of northern Belarus had been shattered. The three survivors provided testimony about what had happened to the Petrov detachment. Their accounts, recorded by Soviet intelligence officers and preserved in archives, paint a picture of systematic brutality. They describe the relentless pursuit through the forest, the machine gunning of wounded comrades, the burning of villages with their inhabitants inside, the execution of captured partisans. They spoke of comrades who had fought to the last bullet, of men who had chosen to end their own lives rather than fall into German hands, of acts of quiet heroism that no one but they would ever remember. But Operation Cottbus was only the beginning. The Germans, emboldened by their apparent success, launched additional operations throughout the summer of 1943. Operation Hermann followed in July and August, targeting the Naliboki forest to the south. The pattern was the same: massive forces, brutal methods, wholesale destruction of villages and their populations. Over 60 villages were burned during Operation Hermann alone. More than 4,000 civilians were murdered. 25,000 more were deported to slave labor. The Bielski Partisans, a Jewish family camp that had grown to include over 700 people, found themselves directly in the path of Operation Hermann. Unlike most partisan units, the Bielski group prioritized rescue over combat. They accepted anyone, fighters and non-fighters alike, young and old, healthy and sick. Their base in the Naliboki forest had become a refuge for Jews fleeing the ghettos and labor camps. The Germans knew about them and had put a price of 100,000 Reichsmarks on the head of Tuvia Bielski, their commander. When Operation Hermann began, Tuvia Bielski made a decision that would save his people. Instead of trying to stand and fight, the group split into small units and dispersed deep into the forest. They abandoned their base camp, leaving behind carefully hidden supplies that they could return to later. For weeks they lived as fugitives, constantly moving, constantly evading German patrols. Some were caught, some died of starvation and disease, but the majority survived. When the operation ended, they reassembled and moved to a new base in the most inaccessible part of the forest. Over 1,200 Jews would survive the war under the protection of the Bielski Group, one of the most remarkable rescue efforts of the Holocaust. The summer of 1943 represented the high water mark of German anti-partisan operations in Belarus. Never before had such massive forces been deployed against the resistance. Never before had the methods been so brutal or the destruction so complete. The German High Command congratulated itself on having pacified the rear areas. But their triumph was illusory. Within weeks of the conclusion of Operation Cottbus, the surviving partisans were already rebuilding. New recruits arrived from the Soviet Union, parachuted in by night, or brought across the lines by guides who knew the secret paths through the German positions. Supplies followed, weapons and ammunition, and radios that allowed the partisans to coordinate their activities with the advancing Red Army. The villages had been destroyed, but the forest remained, and as long as the forest remained, the resistance could not be truly eliminated. The brutal German methods had, in fact, been counterproductive. Every village burned, every civilian murdered, created more partisans. Young men who might have remained passive now had nothing to lose. They joined the resistance not out of ideological conviction, but out of simple vengeance. The German theory that destroying the population would destroy the partisans had proven false. Instead, it had created an enemy that would fight with the desperation of those who knew they faced annihilation regardless of what they did. For the three survivors of the Petrov detachment, the war continued. Yakov Feldman used his medical knowledge to treat wounded partisans and civilians alike. Alexei Morozov became a squad leader in a reconstituted partisan brigade. Young Pyotr Volkov, hardened beyond his years, distinguished himself in combat against German convoys. All three would survive the war, though their paths would diverge in the years that followed. If you're finding value in this deep dive into wartime resistance, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. There are many more untold stories waiting to be explored. The liberation of Belarus came in the summer of 1944 during Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet offensive that destroyed German Army Group Center. The Partisans played a crucial role in this operation, coordinating their attacks with the advancing Red Army to create chaos in the German rear. Railway lines were cut, bridges were blown. German commanders found their communications severed and their supply lines in ruins. The shadow army that the Germans had spent 3 years trying to destroy emerged from the forests to deliver the final blow. Feldman was among the partisans who linked up with advancing Soviet forces near Minsk in early July 1944. He described the moment in testimony recorded after the war. The forest had been our entire world for so long. When we finally walked out onto open ground and saw the Red Army tanks, it was like waking from a nightmare. Some of us wept, some laughed. Some could not believe that we had survived when so many had not. Morozov continued fighting until the very end of the war. He marched with the Red Army through Poland and into Germany, part of the force that would eventually reach Berlin. He survived the street fighting in the German capital and was present when the Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag. For him, the moment was bittersweet. Victory had come, but at a cost that defied comprehension. His entire family was gone. Most of his friends were dead. The country he was fighting for had been devastated. When he returned to Belarus after the war, he found that his home village no longer existed. Young Pyotr Volkov's story took a different turn. Despite his youth, or perhaps because of it, he had difficulty adjusting to peacetime. The skills he had learned in the forest, the instincts that had kept him alive, were useless in the world that emerged after the war. He drifted for several years, working various jobs without finding his place. Eventually, he settled in Minsk and found work at a factory. He married, had children, and lived out his days in relative obscurity. He rarely spoke of his time in the forest, even to his family. The memories were too painful, too raw, even decades later. The legacy of Operation Cottbus and the other anti-partisan operations of 1943 extends far beyond the individual fates of those who participated. These operations represented a systematic campaign of genocide and ethnic cleansing, part of the broader German plan to depopulate Eastern Europe and make room for German settlement. The methods used in Belarus would later be applied elsewhere, particularly in Poland during the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. The scale of destruction in Belarus during the war defies easy comprehension. The Republic lost approximately 1/4 of its entire population, the highest proportion of any Soviet republic. Some estimates suggest that over 2 million Belarusians perished, including virtually the entire Jewish population. Villages that had existed for centuries were erased from the map. Families that had lived on the same land for generations were annihilated. The demographic and social fabric of an entire nation was torn apart. For the German perpetrators, there was little accountability. The officers who planned and executed Operations Cottbus and Hermann, along with dozens of similar operations, largely escaped punishment. Some died in the final battles of the war. Others disappeared into the chaos of defeat. A few were tried for war crimes, but most lived out their days in comfort, their pasts conveniently forgotten in the Cold War era, when former enemies became allies against new threats. The Dirlewanger Battalion met a fitting end. Virtually wiped out in the final battles in Germany, most of its surviving members were captured by Soviet forces and sent to labor camps where they faced the same brutal conditions they had inflicted on others. Oskar Dirlewanger himself was captured by French forces and died in custody under circumstances that remain unclear. Some reports suggest he was beaten to death by Polish guards who knew of his crimes. If so, It was a rare instance of justice in a conflict where justice was in desperately short supply. The memories of the partisan struggle became central to Soviet and later Belarusian national identity. The partisans were celebrated as heroes who had resisted the fascist invaders against impossible odds. Monuments were erected, films were made, books were written. The anniversary of the partisan movement was commemorated with ceremonies and parades. But the full story, with its complexities and moral ambiguities, was often simplified for propaganda purposes. The three survivors of the Petrov detachment each dealt with their memories in their own way. Feldman became a physician after the war, using his medical training to serve the people of Belarus. He rarely spoke publicly about his partisan experience, preferring to focus on the present rather than dwell on the horrors of the past. But those who knew him well understood that the war never truly left him. He was known to wake in the night, startled by sounds that reminded him of the forest. Morozov became an advocate for partisan veterans, working to ensure that their service was recognized and their needs were met. He collected testimony from other survivors, compiling a record of what had happened during those terrible years. His efforts helped preserve the memory of comrades who might otherwise have been forgotten. He died in the 1980s, having outlived most of his fellow partisans. Pyotr Volkov's silence on his wartime experience was finally broken near the end of his life. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, historians and journalists began seeking out the last surviving witnesses to the partisan war. Volkov agreed to give an interview, his first public statement about his experiences in over 50 years. Speaking slowly and carefully, he described the terror of being hunted through the forest, the loss of friends and comrades, the guilt of survival. When asked what message he would want to pass on to future generations, he paused for a long moment before answering. "Remember," he said simply, "just remember. The forests of Belarus have grown back. The villages that were destroyed have been rebuilt or replaced by new communities. The scars on the landscape have healed. But the memory persists, preserved in archives and monuments, in family stories passed down through generations, in the testimony of the few who survived to bear witness." The story of the Petrov detachment is one small chapter in the vast tragedy of the Second World War on the Eastern Front. 117 men and women gave their lives. 3 survived to tell the tale. Their sacrifice was multiplied thousands of times over across the forests and swamps of Belarus, where ordinary people took up arms against an occupier that sought their complete annihilation. In the end, they won. Not the Petrov detachment specifically, most of whom died long before victory came, but the resistance as a whole, the countless partisans who tied down German forces, disrupted supply lines, and demonstrated that occupation could never bring peace. The forest that had witnessed so much death became a symbol of defiance, of the human spirit's refusal to submit to tyranny. The German anti-partisan operations of 1943 killed tens of thousands of people. They destroyed hundreds of villages. They temporarily suppressed organized resistance over vast areas. But they failed in their ultimate objective. They could not break the will to resist. They could not transform terror into submission. They could not, despite their best efforts, create the dead zone they sought. The 3 survivors of the Petrov detachment lived to see their country liberated. They lived to see the enemy defeated. They lived to tell what happened during those 6 weeks when they were hunted through the forest like animals. Their testimony stands as a memorial to those who did not survive, a reminder of what ordinary people endured and what some were willing to sacrifice for freedom. In the birch forests of Belarus, the wind still whispers through the trees. It carries memories of those who fought and died there, partisans and civilians alike. Their names are largely forgotten, lost in the vast anonymity of war. But their struggle is remembered. Their sacrifice is honored. And their story continues to be told, passed from generation to generation, so that the world will never forget what happened in those dark forests during the darkest years of the 20th century. The 6 weeks of pursuit that began in May of 1943 tested human endurance to its absolute limits. For those who did not survive, death came in many forms. Some fell in combat, weapons in hand. Others succumbed to wounds, hunger, or disease. Some were captured and executed. A few, facing certain torture and death, made the terrible choice to end their lives on their own terms rather than give their enemies the satisfaction. For the 3 who survived, life after the war was shaped indelibly by those 6 weeks. Every decision, every relationship, every moment of peace was colored by the memory of what they had endured. They had looked into the abyss of human cruelty and somehow emerged on the other side. They had witnessed evil on a scale that defied comprehension, and they carried that burden for the rest of their days. The partisan war in Belarus was not a sideshow to the main conflict on the Eastern Front. It was an integral part of that conflict, a second front that the Germans could never fully suppress. The resources devoted to anti-partisan operations, the troops and equipment and logistics, were resources that could not be used against the advancing Red Army. Every German soldier guarding a railway line against partisan attack was a soldier who could not fight at the front. Every truck carrying supplies for a punitive expedition was a truck that could not supply the combat troops. This was the ultimate contribution of the Petrov detachment and countless units like them. They forced the Germans to fight a 2-front war within their own occupied territories. They made the occupation costly in blood and treasure. They reminded the German soldiers that they were surrounded by enemies, that danger lurked behind every tree and in every village. This psychological burden weighed heavily on the occupiers, undermining morale and creating a climate of fear and brutality that ultimately turned even more of the population against them. The lessons of the partisan war in Belarus remain relevant to this day. They demonstrate both the power and the limitations of irregular warfare. They show that occupation can never truly succeed when the occupied population refuses to submit. They reveal the terrible human cost of such resistance, the innocent lives lost alongside the fighters, the communities destroyed, the futures erased. For military historians and strategists, the anti-partisan operations of 1943 offer cautionary lessons about the limits of conventional military power. The Germans had overwhelming advantages in firepower, organization, and resources. They controlled the air and dominated the roads. They could concentrate forces and strike with devastating power. Yet they could not defeat an enemy that refused to stand and fight, that melted into the forest and struck from the shadows. The partisan commanders, for their part, demonstrated remarkable adaptive leadership. Faced with extinction, they devised survival strategies that preserved the core of their forces even when the situation seemed hopeless. The order to disperse, issued by commanders like Petrov and Kovalenko, saved lives that would have been lost in futile stand-up fights. The willingness to accept terrible losses in the short term in order to preserve the capacity for future resistance showed strategic wisdom of the highest order. The civilian population paid the highest price of all. Caught between the Germans who would murder them for supporting the partisans and the partisans who would condemn them for collaborating with the Germans, ordinary villagers faced impossible choices. Many tried to remain neutral, providing minimal support to both sides in hopes of surviving. But neutrality was not an option in this war. Sooner or later, everyone was forced to choose, and that choice often meant death. The children who survived the anti-partisan operations carried scars that lasted a lifetime. Many had witnessed the murder of their parents and siblings. Many had experienced hunger, cold, and terror beyond anything children should ever face. Some were orphaned and raised by the partisans, growing up in the forest knowing nothing of normal childhood. Others were captured and sent to German labor camps or, If they were Jewish, to death camps. A few, like young Pyotr Volkov, found ways to survive through luck and cunning. The post-war Soviet Union was not a place conducive to processing trauma. Veterans were expected to celebrate victory, not dwell on suffering. The cult of heroic sacrifice left little room for the complex emotions of survivors. Many partisans, like so many Soviet veterans, buried their memories deep and went about the business of rebuilding their shattered country. Only decades later, in the glasnost era, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, did some begin to speak openly about what they had experienced. The archives that preserve the history of the partisan war have only been partially explored. Many documents remain classified or inaccessible. The full story of what happened in the forests of Belarus during 1943 may never be known. But from the fragments that survive, from the testimony of witnesses like the 3 survivors of the Petrov detachment, a picture emerges of extraordinary courage and equally extraordinary suffering. The German reports on Operation Cottbus and similar operations are chillingly bureaucratic. They record deaths as statistics, villages destroyed as achievements. They express occasional concern about the reliability of the figures, the suspicion that many of those reported as partisans eliminated were actually civilians. But this concern was purely tactical, related to the accuracy of intelligence, not to any moral qualm about the killing itself. The humanity of the victims is absent from these documents, replaced by the cold language of extermination. The Soviet reports created during and after the operations tell a different story. They are filled with names and details, accounts of individual courage and sacrifice. They mourn the fallen even as they celebrate the resistance. They provide the human dimension that the German documents lack. But they too are shaped by ideology and propaganda, emphasizing heroism while downplaying the despair and the terror that must have accompanied it. The truth lies somewhere between these narratives, in the lived experience of those who endured the 6 weeks of pursuit through the forest. The 3 survivors of the Petrov detachment, in their post-war testimony, provided glimpses of that experience. They spoke of fear so intense it was physically painful. They spoke of hunger that drove men to eat things that no human should eat. They spoke of cold that penetrated to the bone and never truly left them. They spoke of the loss of comrades, the constant erosion of hope, the temptation to give up. But they also spoke of moments of grace. A sip of water shared between friends, a word of encouragement when all seemed lost, the sight of a flower blooming in a forest glade, a reminder that beauty still existed even in this hell. The determination renewed each morning to survive one more day, to deny the enemy the satisfaction of their death. These small victories sustained them through the darkest hours. The forest itself was both enemy and ally. It provided cover and concealment, hiding places that even the most thorough search could not find. It provided food for those who knew where to look, roots and berries and bark that could sustain life when nothing else was available. But it was also cold and wet and filled with dangers. Men drowned in swamps. Men died from infected wounds that could not be treated. Men succumbed to diseases that flourished in the damp and the darkness. The forest gave life and took it in equal measure. The end of the 6-week pursuit was not a single moment, but a gradual realization that the Germans had moved on. The sound of gunfire faded. The aircraft no longer circled overhead. The patrols became less frequent and then ceased altogether. For the survivors, this did not bring relief so much as a new kind of terror. They had learned to survive as prey. They did not know how to live as free men. The reunion of the 3 survivors from the Petrov detachment was described in their testimony as one of the most emotional moments of their lives. They had each assumed they were the only ones left. When they found each other, the joy was overwhelming. They embraced and wept, unable to speak. For a long time they simply held each other, feeling the warmth of living human bodies, proof that they were not alone. Then, slowly, they began to share their stories, to piece together what had happened to their comrades, to create a record of sacrifice that would otherwise have been lost. The rebuilding that followed was slow and painful. New recruits had to be trained. New camps had to be established. New networks of support had to be created among a population traumatized by German terror. But the partisans persisted. They had no other choice. Surrender was not an option, not after what they had seen, not after what they knew the Germans would do to anyone who fell into their hands. By the spring of 1944, the partisan movement in Belarus had not only recovered but grown stronger than ever. New brigades had been formed, new supply lines had been established, new connections with Moscow had been made, the lessons of Operation Cottbus had been learned. When the Germans launched new anti-partisan operations, the partisans were better prepared to evade and survive. The terrible winnowing of the summer of 1943 had left behind a corps of hardened veterans who knew every trick of forest warfare. The 3 survivors of the Petrov detachment were among these veterans. Their experience in evading the German pursuit made them valuable instructors for new recruits. They taught the skills that could not be learned from manuals, the instincts that meant the difference between life and death. They taught how to read the forest, how to move without leaving traces, how to find food and water in the wilderness. They taught, above all, the mental discipline required to survive when every impulse screamed to give up. When Operation Bagration began in June of 1944, the partisans were ready. Coordinated attacks along the entire length of the German rear area threw the occupation forces into chaos. Railway lines were cut in dozens of places simultaneously, bridges were blown, depots were raided. German units trying to retreat found themselves ambushed by partisans who knew every path and hiding place. The Shadow Army emerged from the shadows and struck with devastating effect. For the 3 survivors of the Petrov detachment, the liberation was the culmination of everything they had fought for. They had survived the worst the enemy could throw at them. They had seen friends and comrades fall. They had known despair and overcome it. Now, at last, they saw victory. The German occupiers who had hunted them through the forest were themselves being hunted, caught, and destroyed by the advancing Red Army. The memory of those who did not survive haunted them for the rest of their lives. Captain Petrov, who had led with courage and died with dignity. Lieutenant Volkov, who had fought to the last bullet. Sergeant Kovalenko, whose fate remained uncertain for years until a survivor from another unit confirmed that he had been captured and executed in early June. All the others, the men and women whose names filled the roster of the Petrov detachment, each with their own stories, their own hopes and fears, their own reasons for fighting. 117 lives extinguished, 3 saved. The numbers are staggering when multiplied across all the partisan units that operated in Belarus. Tens of thousands of partisans fought. Thousands died. Some were killed in combat. Others were executed after capture. Still others succumbed to disease, starvation, or exposure. The forest that sheltered them also claimed them. By the time of liberation, the partisan movement had suffered casualties proportionally as high as any military force in the war. Yet they persisted. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the partisan struggle. Despite losses that would have broken most conventional military units, despite conditions that made survival itself an act of defiance, despite an enemy that showed no mercy and took no prisoners, the partisans kept fighting. They kept fighting because they had no alternative, because surrender meant death, because the cause they fought for was worth dying for. The 3 survivors of the Petrov detachment understood this better than most. They had been hunted for 6 weeks. They had watched their comrades die. They had come within a hair's breadth of death themselves more times than they could count, and still they survived. Still they fought. Still they bore witness to what had happened in the forests of Belarus during the darkest days of the war. Their testimony is preserved in archives in Minsk and Moscow, recorded by historians and intelligence officers in the years after the war. It provides a human dimension to the statistics and the strategies, a reminder that behind every number was a person with a name and a history and people who loved them. The story of the Petrov detachment is just one story among many, but it stands for all the stories that were never told, all the voices that were silenced before they could speak. In the end, what matters most is that they are remembered, the 117 who died and the 3 who survived. The countless others across Belarus who faced the same enemy and made the same sacrifices. They are the reason that the German occupation ultimately failed, the reason that the forests of Belarus never became the dead zone that the Germans sought to create. Their sacrifice was the foundation upon which liberation was built. The birch trees still stand in the forests of Belarus. The swamps still hold their secrets. And somewhere in those woods, unmarked and forgotten, lie the remains of those who fought and died during the 6 weeks of pursuit in the summer of 1943. They have no monuments, no memorials, no eternal flames. But they have this, the memory of what they did and what they endured, preserved by the 3 who survived to tell the tale. That is their legacy. That is what we must remember. Not the statistics and the strategies, but the human beings behind them. The men and women who chose to resist when resistance seemed hopeless. The partisans who fought and died in the forests of Belarus, hunted like animals but never broken, defeated in battle but victorious in spirit. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be honored. And as long as their story is told, they will not be forgotten.